його немає, так?
Все, гембель.
Все плавно переплить в фуршет.
Це знову таки ваше напрацювання, як організатор. Де фуршет?
І всі горіхи на мене.
Ми Ігорю внесемо це в заріков. Спочатку кожен з вас там щось скаже, потім буде дослідження, потім я вже якісь питання, потім зал якісь питання. Добрий день, працює.
Good afternoon, Ukrainian Media Center Confirm continues its operation. My name is Vasil Samokhvalov, and now we are going to look through a survey and then discuss it. Quite an interesting research called Analyzing Russian Information Security Threats Regarding Corruption in the Ukrainian Media Space. So, whom are we going to discuss it with? It's Ganna Krasnostup, CEO of the Directorate of Information Policy and Information Security of the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine. Maxim Mayorov, an expert of the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security. Pavlo, Buldovych, head of the Department for Coordination of State Information Policy on Corruption Prevention at the NACP, and Fedir Kudrin, analyst at Osavul. I know what's Osavul, but Fedir may tell us in better detail before his presentation. So before we proceed to the presentation, let's make a small introduction, and let's start with Mr. Ganna. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to say that implementation of anti-corruption reform is one of the key tasks of the system of the state government. The Ministry of Information Policy, National Agency for Corruption Prevention, Ministry of Science and Education, we all work on developing zero tolerance to corruption and integrity to become a new norm of life, new standard of life. So, inevitability of accountability for corruption is one of the priorities of the state policy. Unfortunately, our enemy knows about that and they inflict more strikes there. According to the survey of the public sentiment, the biggest problem in Ukraine after the war is the corruption, and their psyops are related to this. They distort any achievements of our anti-corruption agencies, unfortunately. Sometimes they say that black is white. When we draw everyone's attention to the investigations, they say we have like crazy corruption, and it draws attention not only from our society but from our partners that can influence the provision of military aid to Ukraine in a negative way. But we are not alone. That's the good news. We have a lot of experts who research those psyops of the enemy, those narratives, their tools, and taking into account all that information, we can better and efficiently implement our state information policy. Thank you very much. We have Maxim, who represents the center, which knows a lot about psyops, information threats, and all that stuff. So please, Mr. Maxim, dear colleagues, as Ms. Anna has mentioned, corruption is a very serious problem. And we are used to looking at the problem of corruption under a different angle. We focus on the destructive effect of corruption. It destroys democracy, destroys free society. And on top of that, we see that corruption proliferates in non-democratic countries where those countries that are enemies of Ukraine. We know in Russia the corruption is like real tremendous, humongous. Russia tries to develop their sphere of influence, and the methods they use is the corruption. They corrupt the regimes in the neighboring countries, and thus they exercise their influence. But on top of other things, there is a different dimension of corruption that is related to what you've mentioned, the psyops, propaganda, and it's related to the fact that such societies as Ukrainian, we have very low tolerance of a corruption, not in the sense that corruption does not exist in Ukraine, but in the sense that the public sentiment about corruption or suspicion of corruption plays an important role for Ukrainians. So there was already statistics provided that 89% of Ukrainians think that corruption is number 2 problem in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion, and of course that's the very fertile soil for Russian psyops, because manipulating, speculating, parasiting on the topic of corruption, on the fear of corruption, repulsiveness of corruption, you can undermine the faith of Ukrainian society in government institutions, weakening Ukraine in this fight against Russian aggression. And basically this survey that we are about to present today is what conducted by the Center of Strategic Communications and Information Security in coordination with the partners analytical team Osavul. It was made under the framework of the State Communication Campaign on Preventing Corruption, based on the materials of the second half of the year 23. So the essence of the survey, the hypothesis, was to understand whether this topic of corruption is used by Russian propaganda. So there was a methodologically complex task, because really that's an organic factor, the dissatisfaction of the society with the corruption, but there are Russian speculations over the Ukrainian corruption, and this survey will demonstrate the Russian input in the perception of the corruption and the consequences. So we will cover the narratives that were promoted by the enemy and the methods they used to do that. Our partners will tell us in better detail about the partners from Osavul, and I will wrap up here. Yeah, right, we have another person here, Mr. Pavlo. You represent the agency which identifies the anti-corruption policy in the country and who does the prevention as well. So tell us about the importance of this survey. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank our partners from the Ministry of Culture, Center for Strategic Communication, for this important research. We, as an NACP, we deal with corruption, and the Stratcom deals with misinformation, and the points of our partnership is the research of the narratives of corruption. The multiple information campaigns of Russia is one of the key tools, one of the key weapons of Russian information war against Ukraine and the rest of the civilized world, not only from the year 22 or year even 14, but that's an intense and very ancient method. Why corruption is in focus in context of misinformation? Well, the fertile soil for spreading the misinformation narratives are always the points of tension, the most deeply rooted problems that concern the society and divide it. This is why corruption is the perfect topic for misinformation. And in perception of Ukrainians, corruption is not only something that can be identified as corruption according to the law. In the mass conscious, the corruption is about the quality of public management or incapacity of the government to do something, or incapacity of the citizens to them who justify their civil position by the corruptedness of some government agencies. It's a lack of trust in the government and the initiatives. It's about division into friends of foes within one community. So this topic of corruption has a very intense deconsolidating aspect. This is why the enemy uses this topic a lot. I want to thank once again the colleagues. As the colleagues have mentioned, NACP had this study on the perception of corruption and corruption experience of the population, and 90% of the population think that corruption is very or relatively widespread in the country. This is the last year research, but last week we've seen the most fresh research from rating sociological group, and now this corruption reflects in armed aggression too. So in the logic of propaganda, if corruption is more important than the war, then all those who commit the corruption are more evil than the enemy. So we have to canalize the societal energy not against the enemy, but rather against those who commit corruption, the government, the state agencies. This is why the corruption reinforces the public fatigue, and thus the enemy achieves two goals: the motivation of the society and deconsolidation, division of the society, which is of great threat given the historic moment. This is why we have to join the efforts of all of the institutions, specifically those involved in communication. We have to change the discourse, and we have to remove all those layers which are united into one notion of total corruptedness of the country. So from the real corruption, from its experience, we have to rechannel this attention against the real corruption, to reestablish the trust in government and state initiatives through communication practices. I hope we will be able to discuss this topic. Well, even for me, as a prepared and well-trained person, all those stories with corruption, they divide even me inside. So, Mr. Ihor, can you please tell us what is Osavul, what kind of platform is this, and please bring the presentation to the screen. Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank for this opportunity to take part in this important survey, and secondly, thank you for the organization of this great discussion. I'm a representative of Osavul company. Osavul was established after the beginning of the full-scale invasion as a response to the mass Russian psyops and propaganda activities, and we engage AI in analyzing information space, detection of threats, and analyzing the sources. First of all, I would like to tell you about the methods we were using for this survey, what were the steps taken. So first of all, using the keywords related to corruption, recoil, and similar lexicons, we've created the massive, we've generalized the massive of the messages that were penetrating the Ukrainian information space, and then using the AIR system has broken all that massive down into a number of categories, specific information incidents related to one topic. We've looked through those incidents and we've segregated 86 that can be classified as threatening ones. So what were the threatening incidents? First of all, those are the incidents in which the sources either directly related to the Russia were taking part, that were on SBU list, or other agencies and organizations that deal with countering misinformation. And secondly, the information incidents that had obvious negative influence on us, some destructive influence. After we've segregated those main threats, we've analyzed them, and we were able to isolate some specific narratives to which they were related and tactics using which they were promoted, or with the help of which those information incidents are getting their threatening nature. So the overall statistics, the number of messages analyzed, the number of incidents formulated, and the number of sources identified. I will give more color about the sources, by the way, a little bit later. So working with different information campaigns like previously, and during this survey we were documenting the sources that don't look authentic. They either have inadequate number of views and subscribers related to the number of elections, which is an evidence of non-authentic nature of theirs, or they are the sources united into networks, so-called networks, who spread the same propaganda content, and also they were sources. I will tell you in detail about the tactics, but they're the huge networks of sources who position themselves as Ukrainian ones, and they are the authors, the content creators in the Ukrainian information space. So here we're talking about the networks as на самом деле в Киеве, на самом деле в Харькове, what's really going on in Kiev, here really going on in Kharkiv, or like vertical or country's policy. What's their main threat and why the Russians use these tactics? It was used during all of the incidents that we were analyzing. Due to the fact that those sources, they are kind of a bridge between Russian and Ukrainian information spaces, respectively. They create a fake that the Russian media starts disseminating, including the government-controlled ones, through these type of resources. These narratives, these fakes, end up in Ukrainian information space and start being spreaded by Ukrainian sources, which are not compromised or hostile against Ukraine. They just don't follow the information hygiene rules, and that's the situation we were facing multiple times. That's a case for Ukrainian sources who have anti-government nature. They consume a lot of such narratives very frequently. Then the networks that we were mentioning, that's a very peculiar story, because the Russians frequently resort to the situations where they don't directly make reports from one channel to another, but they make similar messages. They just copy the message from one to another, just changing a couple of words, and this is where our system helps us, that helps us to group and unify everything. We may say that there is the number of such networks which unite Ukrainian, Russian, and pseudo-Ukrainian information spaces. So it's about the pool of channels. Spreading facts about the cases of corruption in Ukraine. Russia is glorious about this thing. We didn't have a lot of incidents like this, but some of those were quite destructive, specifically when they ended up in Ukrainian information space, and Russia takes a creative approach here. They adapt to the context. One of interesting examples of such fake was spreading information about the events in Israel in October. The most famous confectioner of Tel Aviv made a cake shaped as a Han Volodymyr Zelensky due to the total corruption, because due to total corruption in Ukraine, the American weapons ended up in Hamas hands. They were trying to promote this narrative for the English-speaking audience in Twitter too, but it didn't. It was not perceived quite well, but such stories do happen. Then cultivation of the conspiracy theories, because it's a matter of discussion what can be considered a fake or what can be considered a conspiracy theory. But again, in Western societies, in Ukrainian society, they adapt to anti-elite trends, you know, when they talk about the conspiracy of pedophiles or conspiracy or Jewish conspiracy, global Jewish conspiracy. In this context, the Russians were spreading information about Olena Zelenska having taken part in children trafficking. So it was all related to the Epstein list scandals. Thus, Russians wanted to influence the Western discourse, as it was mentioned. Russia aims their information efforts to reduce the aid coming to Ukraine. Another thing is distortion of information. Usually Russians just take an article from the Western media, or for example a report of NACP, and they spread it, distorting some statements, distorting the sense, or adding some negative notes. For example, there was a case when NACP reported about reduction of level of corruption within the last couple of years in Ukraine, and Russian networks of pro-Russian channels in Ukraine, they were making the same messages, reporting the same news with some caustic comment in the end. And given the Ukrainian distrust in corruptedness of the government and distrust in the government, was fallen into quite a fertile soil. So talking about manipulative and generalizing statements, when some news or some statements contain no information, just in some general words, there is a mention of total corruption in Ukraine, and all that thing is being repeated again and again, being reiterated. So thus they are just trying to create this background as... So is it just a clickbait, or is it like not quite smart people spreading Russian fakes? Well, NACP is stating that Ukraine is coming closer to the countries with the lowest levels of corruption practices. Yeah, this is exactly how they distort the information provided here. Right. Honestly, I'm not seeing it, but the general sense is like that. So it's not like they promote some fakes or scandals. They just throw in some general phrases. Yes, there is the original source, the mirror of the week, and in the middle there is a post containing some manipulative information. Right, thank you. Also, they refer to the statements of the third parties to confirm their statements, to corroborate, so to say, their statements. Yeah, it's also about the distortion of facts. Russia has a lot of experts in the West with pro-Russian position, or, well, not a lot, some pool of such experts, and referring to Russians who, well, not referring to Russians who are directly opposing Ukraine, they refer to other experts who state that Ukraine is a corrupted state. It's not like Solovey says that Ukraine is a corrupted state, but he refers Fico, for example, or the covering of the facts of fighting corruption as facts as the evidences of the high level of corruption. So, for example, there is some public case, there is journalist investigation, and Russians frequently reprint or copy those news, but in a different context, as if it's not a report of solution of the case. It's not like fighting the process of fighting corruption, but it's a permanent information background when one revelation comes after of corruption comes after another, and we get a feeling that there are corruption scandals going on in Ukraine on a daily basis, and respectively Ukraine is totally corrupt. Then we proceed to the narratives that we've isolated and having analyzed the threats. Well, they're not segregated as a separate slides, so let's go list by list. First, Zelensky covers the facts of corruption of Ukraine. Zelensky is related to corruption. That's anti-elite narrative. That's quite plain. However, Russians, they have a fertile soil here, and very frequently there were bots involved who were posting comments in the popular internet pages, including Facebook page of President Zelensky, and it was all picked up by and disseminated through Telegram networks, and it was saying that Zelensky, and very frequent targets are Mr. Yermak, Mr. Tatarov, that they are directly involved in some corruption, they are corrupt, or they cover or they suppress the attempts of the civil society to reveal this corruption. For example, there was an incident when Russians, referring to Nigerian newspaper called The Nation, it's not even a mass media, it's just a fake page. So over there they published a fake that during the visit of Volodymyr Zelensky to New York for the session of the United Nations, Olena Zelenska entered a boutique to buy some jewelry for herself, and she was acting insolent with the cashier in that shop, who was then fired, and she was interviewed by The Nation newspaper, who published it in this report in Nigeria, and thus Russians were trying to spread it in the countries of the West. Well, second, is Ukraine a totally corrupt country? This is the most general narrative, and here we were relating the narratives which we could not relate to other narratives. This is about distortion. This is about the distortion of information background. For example, the Russians were spreading the address of a woman from Kherson region who was saying that Ukraine is completely corrupt. We have to fight the government and the stuff like that. Then the fact that Ukraine is losing the war because of the corruption in their government, and the West presses on Ukraine. In this case, the Russians resorted to referring the Western media that were talking about the relations with the partner countries, all those issues related to weapons aid. I think that this situation with the aid to Ukraine is very convenient for the Russians, because they may always say that Ukraine does not get the aid because it's absolutely corrupt. I understand, quite a sensitive topic for Ukrainian society, and they quite frequently were referring in this context to the fact that there is embezzlement in military units, the eggs cost 8 hryvnias. They were reiterating the same stories again and again, so this is the situation. Next, Ukraine is connected with the Western elites with the corruption ties. That's related to the Epstein list, conspiracy theories. For example, there was a number of incidents that Russians were trying to spread about the family of Soros, or the Biden's family, trying to buy land in Ukraine to establish the place of burial of nuclear fuel waste there. Also, the Russians were distorting the news about Mike Pompeo getting a share in the Kyivstar company. It was spread mostly in Russian information space and in pro-Russian Ukrainian media. And it did not leak a lot into Ukrainian information space. Then number 5 is the accusal of government in their corruption. But it is like the same narrative that Ukraine is a corrupt country, but here it's very anti-government. So it's not like the corruption is blossoming in Ukraine, but they say that due to the effect of corruption, overall corruption, the Ukrainian state is a failed state, it's not worth dying for, and it's better to have it disappear. Also, another mention is the anti-elite narrative that the political government takes advantage of the military. They sacrifice the soldiers to fill their pockets and then to leave for West for retirement. And number 7 is about Ukraine reselling Western supplied weapons, the ancient narrative that exists since the beginning of the full-scale invasion and is related to the fact that either consciously or through lack of control over the weapons or the failed state nature of Ukrainian state, those weapons provided by the Western partners are leaking to the third parties like ISIS or Hamas. In this context, I can also recall the cake that I was mentioned. Also, Russians were spreading the fake address of the Hamas leader who extends his appreciation to Ukrainians and Zelensky for handing over the wonderful weapons to Hamas so they could attack Israel. Is that it? Okay, so let's proceed to the discussion. What should we do about it? Let me start with myself. Well, regardless of all those statements, all those fakes and narratives spread by Russian Federation, we realize that anti-corruption reform is inevitable. Our youth has zero tolerance to corruption. We have to do these education activities by ourselves. Prevention mechanisms. Today anybody can inform about corruption. Please, there is a mechanism that we popularize and promote. And on behalf of the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy, I want to say we're not gonna stop, and every cases of bringing anybody to legal liability for acts of corruption is something that will be covered by us, and no Russians are gonna stop us. Everybody should be aware about us holding the perpetrators accountable. Our soldiers are fighting for our land, for our country, and let's do everything possible so we don't feel ashamed in front of our children, in front of our grandchildren. And fighting corruption is one of the focuses of the state policy. Do you want anything to it? Well, because I see we have a lot of information cases that Russians use somehow, and they mainly derive from the NACP, and like in Belarus and Russia, nobody writes about corruption, means there is no corruption. And in our case, if we mention corruption, means we have corruption. So what is your advice? Should we mention corruption or should we omit all those mentions? Well, we should cover corruption, we should give publicity, because we are democratic, transparent country, and it's our advantage in front of the enemy, it's our plans. Plus, only in totalitarian societies this topic is being censored, but for us it's important to have our citizens understand why the things are happening this way. It's not only because we talk about the corruption all the time, but the fact that we cover those topics is the evidence of the freedom of media in our country and the facts of fighting corruption. Currently, all of the media are mostly like interested in some cases of that create some sentiment in the citizens. We have to change the discourse. We have to focus attention on the success that we have. We have a lot of success in creating the legal alternatives to existing corruption practices, such as digital services, compliance procedures, building capacity. We've made a huge leap forward, and it's even reflected in the index of corruption perception. We've demonstrated like a very good pace. NACP is the developer of State Anti-Corruption Program, State Anti-Corruption Strategy, and for efficient communication of those global documents, fundamental documents, who basically are the program of activities of the government, because it covers a lot of activities in different areas. So to communicate all those things, NACP developed, and the government has approved the strategy of corruption prevention until year 2025. That's an ambitious project, and it's made in coordination with other agencies, including the Ministry of Culture. And this document contemplates a lot of activities, communication activities aimed at changing behavior, at discourse changing. And one of the tasks of this document is to create the communication infrastructure. So the union of communication persons in one media can communicate all those messages, anti-corruption activities, in a proper way to the society as an anti-corruption policy. We have a lot of campaigns, a lot of activities. It's not like I want to give a lot of detail about them, but what I want to emphasize, the efficient countering the misinformation narratives is only possible not so much thanks to the spreading the media literacy, but misinformation is efficient when, or is not efficient when people are not inclined to trust those narratives. They have more trust in government, they have more trust in the state, and if we have the proper level of trust, the perception of those misinformation narratives will be way lower. This is why we have a huge task to improve the level to the government institutions, to the government initiatives. We have to communicate our advantages, our anti-corruption tools. So that's a long game. That's a very complex story, given all those deeply rooted problems in the society, the collective perception of the corruption, which is overflowing. Why have I been mentioning the perception as an important indicator? 90% perceive corruption as high, but corruption experience, again, according to the survey by NACP, is 20%. So this is the real corruption experience. Here you go with the real facts of corruption. They are at least 4 times smaller than the stated. So the perceived level, which means the perceived level is way higher. And is the matter of discourse, is the consequence of spreading those misinformation propaganda narratives that we're discussing. So I would like to ask Mr. Maxim, you were saying about the long game, and we want to talk about short game here. We have a survey here, we understand the narratives, and we understand that first the population is being traumatized, and we see the consequences of this story in the West, where the sentiment is a little bit different from that existed 2 years ago. So once again, my question is, what should we do about this right here and right now? So talking about our survey, it's one of the topics that for which you don't get a lot of appreciation. It's like we take the role of the devil's advocate. The people criticize corruption, and it's the right thing to do. And now there is a survey that says that a lot of this criticizing was unjustified. It can be irritating. It can even result in some accusations regarding the authors of this survey, but the goal was quite noble. We really need to isolate the real things. We have to demonstrate, yes, there is certain level of corruption. Corruption exists everywhere, in the south, in the west, in the east, everywhere is the global evil, the evil of corruption, the evil of the globe, corruption, the evil of humanity. But all those threats which are related to Ukraine, they are overstated and politicized, and the goal of politicization is not to rectify the mistakes, but rather to destroy the very fabric of the society. First of all, the topic is to draw everyone's attention. People have to see it, whether they have trust or not. People have to ponder over, maybe somehow, someday they will agree with it. They will understand that someday, before they were succumbing to those Russian narratives. We don't want to ruin the anti-corruption discourse. You see, during today's event, we have a representative of NACP, which means we don't want to whiten corruption here one way or another, but still we have to demonstrate the real scale of corruption on the background of the corruption hype, and we should grab Russia by their hand in this story. That was our mission, and we hope that at least this survey will be, so to say, one of the first steps to help the society, to help our audience to at least ponder over the information hygiene. At least, do we have any questions on the floor? Well, if we don't have any questions on the floor, then let me ask you. Well, we understand what should we do inside Ukraine, alright, but what should we do with the Western audience? Whoever wants to answer. Well, our audience is quite simple. They read the reports of our investigators and they draw very simple conclusions. Well, talking about the Western audience, we see how Russian information distorts the facts and they spread the information. They don't only use those methods to highlight the corruption in Ukraine, but they do the same with our gender policy, like when we've made our civilizational choice and when we try to improve the implementation of the JC principles in our state policy, they get either things highlighted and they oppose it to the traditional values. And in the West, during any meetings with the colleagues, we highlight these facts. There is OSCE conference. Well, that's a good presentation to have it translated into English and to demonstrate the facts. Yes, to demonstrate the facts, how this information is being isolated and transformed into fake. That's the key thing. We proactively inform their societies. Well, again, getting back to what I was saying about our strategy, the state communication strategy, we have a lot of information campaigns contemplated there. And if we talk about the short-term responses to these threats, we should add messages to our communication products. For example, we work with one enlightenment product called The Price of the State. They contacted us first, and their audience are like highly qualified people who know a lot about economy, and they say that a lot of our vis-a-vis are telling that Ukraine is recoiling to Yanukovych era corruption level. Yeah, there is such an impression, yes, but again, there was a different discourse, so we have to debunk all those things and we add all those messages to this product that we manufacture together with them. So this survey is only the first step of our strategy, because further on, within the next couple of years until the end of the year 25, it's contemplated that in coordination with Stratcom, with Center for Counter and Misinformation and Center and Security Service of Ukraine, we have to keep track of all those narratives and we have to develop the antidote. We have to formulate the counter narratives and spread them respectively. If the task of our strategy is the work with the Ukrainian audience, the internal audience, we also understand that we cannot ignored the request from outside, because we are very dependent on financial aid, on weapons aid. We depend on the Western partners, the rest of the world, and in the same way we're working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about the necessity to supply some or communicating some information about our anti-corruption efforts by our ambassadors, somebody who talks to some famous foreign media to communicate our anti-corruption achievements to them, because we have a lot of communications and we understand that there is some deficit of information coming from our deficit about achievements of Ukraine in anti-corruption sector. Well, let me add a couple of words. If we just tell our partners like, no, that's not true, we're not corrupted, it's not going to convince them, because we have an interest, right, of posing ourselves in the right light. But the fact is that Ukraine is taking part in a number of processes now where we voluntarily put ourselves under microscope. For example, European integration, fulfilling the tasks under the integration plan, and we're talking about the control of the Western weapons, quite a strict control exercised by our partners who provide us with weapons, where these weapons are, how are they used, how are they applied. So we voluntarily provide them with monitoring and control mechanisms of the real corruption situation, and all that thing transforms into reports, not our Ukrainian ones, but it transforms into some documents. And what we still have to do is not to convince them with our words that we are not corrupt, but we have to promote those documents that our foreign partners put together about us, like, look, that's your experts, that's your conclusions, those are the conclusions of international organizations. It's not us boasting, that's the objective picture that the international community can get thanks to the fact that we voluntarily put ourselves under that microscope. Well, we have questions on the floor. The microphone, please. I have a couple of questions to the authors of the survey. Have you analyzed only the media, like a mass media and social networks? And if so, can you please tell us what were the social networks that you've checked, and what is the role of Telegram in misinformation? And about corruption too. And is there a difference? Is there any tendency of Russian information propaganda being perceived on different levels in different countries? How do they launch it in Europe, in the United States? How do they launch it in their internal market, for example? Thank you for your question. So first, about the platforms, we were not only checking the media, we were analyzing YouTube, Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter on top of web resources. And yes, talking about Telegram, it's obvious that Telegram is a huge source of misinformation. I think that 3/3 of the threats that were detected by our system and our analytical team, they derive from Telegram. Because Telegram, both in Ukraine and in the West, is the place of spreading conspiracy theories. In the United States, there is a number of adherents of QAnon theory and opponents of Ukrainian support, opponents of of American elites. They communicate via Telegram, and Russia assists it. And media empire of pro-Russian channels, it resides in Telegram too. Talking about other platforms, Facebook, something that we were seeing in Facebook, those are coordinated dissemination of the same messages in the comments in popular pages. They do to increase the audience. They would rather put it under the Zelensky's post than in the account of a bot with 5 viewers. And talking about different countries, well, the problem is that the discourse is difficult to segregate because the main Russian information efforts aimed at Western societies, they are happening through those conspiracy groups and communities in Telegram, but to significant extent is going through Twitter. And in Twitter, Russians do different languages. Obviously, they spread the majority of the fakes in English, Spanish, German, but they hardly adapt their discourse. There are Telegram channels and Twitter accounts in Vietnamese language, and they copy the same messages from RIA Novosti than the channels in the Spanish channels, so they adapt this discourse quite weakly. And where is it perceived well? It's perceived well in the countries where there is a huge number of people who mistrust their governments, who mistrust their media, and in this context it's clear the seeds are getting into fertile soil. Thank you very much. Now that we've touched upon the topic of our Western partners, they have such a story as learned lessons in their management. So what would we do in a different way now? When this topic emerged first, yeah, it emerged like about 1.5 years. So what were the lessons we've learned? What should we do in a different way? What are we going to do in a different way in future? Well, let me get back to the media literacy a little bit, because usually media literacy is like discussed in the context of a consumer, a person who reads information in Telegram channels, but also it's about the people who spread and create that information, because in our work we had cases when Ukrainian popular media copied a post of the Politika Strany, making the same mistake there. So it's an urge to Ukrainian journalists to analyze where the information is coming from, because Ukrainian media community definitely are not going to spread some direct plain fakes, but some manipulations or things that are half true, those which are in this gray zone. They may end up in Ukrainian discourse and thus be poisoned with mistrust in their own government. If we don't have anything to add to this, let's wrap up. Well, let me repeat once again, we have to implement the anti-corruption reforms, so we have something to inform our partners on. We believe in the bright future. Even those cases that we unfortunately have, we're countering them with our colleagues, and we will continue highlighting it for our population. I want to thank all of the panelists. We were discussing very important topic, how the Russians use the topic of corruption in PSYOPs against Ukraine, in Ukraine and in the West. We've discussed how to sort it out, and we'll continue sorting it out. So I want to thank all of the panelists for participation in this panel discussion. Ukraine Media Center, Ukraine Forum will continue its operation tomorrow. See you shortly.